तेरा रूप सुनहरा।
Jungkook's chest tightened as his eyes landed on Van's motionless body laying on the cold, streaked floor. Her pale face, the bruises scattered across her delicate skin, and trickling from the head sent a piercing pain through his heart. He screamed, his voice raw with desperation, as he ran towards her, falling to his knees beside her limp form. His hands trembled as he gently scooped her into his arms, pressing her close to his chest, as though trying to shield her from the further harm. Jimin just steps behind, froze momentarily as he took in the scene, his stomach churning at the sight of Van's battered condition. He watched as Jungkook rose to his feet, holding her tightly, his face contoured with fear and anguish. With a word, Jungkook moved, his long strides taking him out of the place, driven by nothing but the desperate need to save her. The ride to the hospital was a blur. Jungkook's heart hammered in his chest, his mind replaying the horrific image of Van laying there. He held her closer, whispering, "Hold on, Van, please." His voice cracked, his raw emotion surfacing for the first time, breaking through the hardened exterior he usually wore. As soon as they reached the hospital, Jungkook stormed in, his voice echoing through the halls as he shouted, "Where's the doctor?" His voice carried desperation and fury, startling the nearby staff. A doctor hurried over, alarmed by the scene. "What happened?" Jungkook, still visibly shaking, growled through gritted teeth. "She's hurt and do something." His rage barely masked the fear that was tearing him apart. The doctor took one glance at Van's condition, surely a police case to handle, but then the man in front of her won't seem he is in the mood to listen to anyone. She immediately sprang into action upon his threat. "Nurse, prepare the emergency room. We need to operate on her immediately." Van was taken from Jungkook's arm and he froze for a moment, reluctant to let go before stepping back. As the doors of the emergency room closed, the doctor turned to him. "We have to stay outside. We'll take care of her." But staying outside was torment Jungkook couldn't bear. He paced in hallway, his hands clawing at his hair as guilt consumed him. "This is all my fault," he muttered, his voice barely audible but heavy with self-loathing. "Jungkook," he tried, his voice calm but firm, "this isn't your fault. No one could have predicted this." Jungkook ignored him, his fist clenching until his knuckles turned white. "I should have stayed away from her. If I wasn't in her life, this wouldn't have happened. She's paying for my mistakes, Jimin." He dropped to his knees, his head hanging low as he clawed at his scalp, the weight of his guilt crushing him. Jimin knelt beside him, trying to offer comfort. "You can't blame yourself or someone else ever. We should be aware that President Kang would go to any extent." At the mention of the name, something in Jungkook snapped, his trembling body stilled, and when he looked up, Jimin saw it, that dark, terrifying rage that made him even shudder. Jungkook stood abruptly, his entire demeanor shifting. Guilt-stricken person disappeared, and in his place stood a predator, his jaw tight, his eyes cold, filled with murderous intent. "Jungkook," he warned, his voice hesitant. "Don't do something you'll regret." Jungkook turned to him, his voice low but venomous. "Regret? That's exactly what I'm going to make him feel. 100 times over." He dared to touch her. His voice broke slightly, betraying the storm of emotion beneath the surface. "She shouldn't have been dragged in my mess, but he did it. Now he's going to pay." Jimin wanted to stop him, but he knew better. The rage consuming Jungkook now was unstoppable, a force even he feared to stand against. As Jungkook stormed out of the hospital, Jimin pulled out his phone, his hands shaking slightly. "I need to inform Mr. Jeon," he muttered, dialing the number. President Kang's office echoed with furious shouts, his face red with anger. "What do you mean she is not his sister?" he bellowed, slamming his hand on the desk, the picture of the girl sent by his man on the screen, his phone mocking him. "Idiots, I gave you simple tasks and you couldn't even get the right girl." He paced around, jabbing at his phone repeatedly. No one was answering his calls. Where are those useless fools now? His voice grew louder with each passing second of silence. Turning to one of his guards, he barked, Find out what happened. Why are they not responding? Go. Just as the guard moved to leave, the distant sound of chaos erupted. At the first, it was faint, muffled rustling and hurried footsteps. Then come unmistakable cracks of loud, relentless. The door to the room burst open, and one of his men staggered in, his chest soaked with. Prisoner, the man gaped as his voice weak. They are here, so many of them. Everywhere. He didn't finish. His legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the floor lifeless. For a moment, Prisoner Kang stood frozen, his chest tightened with a flicker of fear, but he masked it with a scowl. Who is it? Who dares? One of his remaining bodyguards interrupted him. Prisoner, we are surrounded. There is no way out. We have to move you to a safe room now. The outside intensified, Stacco rhythm growing louder and more menacing as they rushed him out of the room. Kang's eyes started towards the streaked halls. His men sprawled, their lifeless forms stark reminders of the attack's ferocity. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm, his expression hardening. Mr. Kang's right man hand, a towering figure of muscle discipline, led the way, shielding him with his massive frame. The sight of the man who had saved him countless times before offered a Kang's silver reassurance. They descended into the basement, the air thick with tension. The sound of chaos above persisted, unrelenting. The two armed men awaited them, stationed as the last line of defense. Prisoner Kang sank into a chair, his fist clenched, his fury remained, but for the first time it was tinged with unease. The unthinkable had happened. Someone had dared to breach his fortress-like security, and deep down, as the gunfire raged on, he knew there was only one person capable of such audacious move. Jungkook, he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling just slightly. Anger flared in his eyes, but behind it a glint of fear flickered. The outside raged for what felt like hours, but eventually the deafening sound stopped. A tense silence followed, thick and suffocating. In the stillness, Prisoner Kang's heart raced. He dared to hope his men had won. Perhaps the attackers were dead. But his hope crumbled the moment he heard slow, deliberate footsteps heading towards the basement. Each step sent a jolt of anxiety through him. His grips on the gun tightened, his palms slick with the sweat. Why? He muttered under his breath, trying to steady himself. I didn't even catch his sister. What made him triggered like this? He had underestimated Jungkook, thinking he was still that weakling boy he had strapped in years ago. Just because a businessman handling his father's business, he heard of a small altercation, but nothing like this. The sheer destruction of his security was unimaginable. The footsteps grew louder, more purposeful. President Kang flinched as the loud banging suddenly erupted against the door. He aimed his gun, his fingers trembling. The door is unbreakable, he whispered to himself, seeking comfort. No one can get through it, no one. But the banging didn't stop, each heart echoing his growing fear. He could faintly hear Jungkook shouting his name from the other side, though the thick walls muffled the sound. The noise suddenly ceased, but soon the silence replaced by a ominous. The door locking mechanism clicked. Kang's blood ran cold. No, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Only he and his right man had access. How? The door creaked open and smoke billowed into the room. President Kang instinctively fired his gun, emptying the chamber, but the shadow stepping through the struck that was tossed into the room. President Kang froze, his grip on the gun slackening, and then he saw him. Jungkook's clothes and hands were soaked, his expression colder than Kang had ever seen. He didn't look like human, he looked like monster. Mr. Kang's fingers fumbled on the trigger as he aimlessly, but the clicked empty. He had used all his on the head. Jungkook stepped closer, each slow, deliberate movement dripping with menace. Kang stumbled back, dropping the useless. Jungkook, he stammered, words catching his thought. Jungkook didn't answer. In one swift motion, he swung his arm, sending Kang flying across the room. His crashed into, and the impact shot through him, and his vision blurred. You made the worst mistake of your life to hurt her, he growled, his voice low but shaking with fury. You dared to touch someone who had nothing to do with this. Kang groaned, trying to push himself up, but Jungkook already on him. In a force to hurt the Kang screamed as his pain shot through his ribs. You ruined my life years ago, framed me, sent me to rot on a crime I didn't commit, and I stay quiet, but this is where it ends. President couldn't understand why Jeon Jungkook was reacting that way, and he was failed to execute his plan to capture his sister. But it looks like this girl means him so much. Somehow he feels satisfied seeing him in this condition. Kang gasped, clutching his rib as he tried to sit up. Did it make you feel pain? He choked out but smiled evilly. Jungkook just glanced as he grabbed Kang by the collar and slammed him against the wall. He screams, "She's just a high schooler, how can you? She's the last person who should be suffer because of you." But Mr. Kang still smiles covered in. Even his plan failed, but he got what he wanted, to see Jeon Jungkook completely losing his mind. It's good to see you embracing the monster you truly are, hiding behind a mask that no one knows. Go ahead, kill me. I'm sure you realized the sight of her broken, battered body. It was final straw for Jungkook to grab a heavy metal object near, intent to finishing him. Another fear entered Jimin, who followed Jungkook all the way here, knowing he isn't his right mind. Jungkook, stop, he shouted, his voice cutting through the haze of Jungkook's rays. Jungkook didn't even look at him. Stay out of this, Jimin, he warned. This man deserves everything coming to him. He wanted to end because he can't see the annoying smile of victory on President Kang's face. And then he countered, stepping closer. Won't change anything. It only make things worse for you, for everyone. Jungkook hesitated for a moment, his chest heaving. He wanted to see you lose control and getting satisfied witnessing in this situation. Don't let him ruin you, overpower your senses. One mistake and he'll had upper hand in case. I no longer care about that anymore. He's ready to sacrifice, to take the blame, his grave, just so he could kill the man in front of him. Jimmy knew that he couldn't able to control the raging Jungkook the moment they witnessed Van's almost body laying on the ground, but Jungkook had done enough damage. Can't let him what President Kang actually wants him to, because Jungkook isn't like this. He is not monster, more human than people like President Kang. He'll be won and proved right that you are the criminal and be free from all his sins he had committed, including trying to kill his own son. He knew what President Kang's actual intentions. Jimin knew that Mr. Kang actually do not care about anything, not even his own son, whom he deliberately keeping in coma for years. So his secret will stay hidden forever from public's eyes. And once the case proceeds further, not only secrets related to this, but many crimes he had committed will come out eventually. The dirty place. Mr. Kang wants to reverse the situation, to blame everything on Jungkook, to make him the real villain. What? After Jonghyun's accident, when you went to detention center, that accident wasn't just an accident, but Mr. Kang himself has tried to his own son, right, Mr. Kang? Anyone could see that President Kang was sweating bullets by the time Jimin started to tell the truth, while Jungkook was still in confusion because he wasn't there when everything happened, and he has least knowledge of this all. What are you trying to say? He screams. Who would want it to their own child? You, of course, he said with a smug smile, seeing the desperation and fear on Mr. Kang's face. You wanted to your own son after he got caught into circulating the illegal substance in the school. After all, a son take after from his father, and you knew that he got addicted to wrong things, yet you didn't pay much attention to it until it brought trouble to you. And if the case had proceeded further, your dirty deeds will no longer be secret anymore. Jungkook stood there frozen, astounded of how Jimin knew all these things. Where did you find all of this? He asked, and Jimin's expression turned serious because he had hid a big secret from his best friend, but it was for his own well-being. I was not only keeping eyes on Jonghyun for years just because he told me, Jungkook, but also because of Mr. Jeon. Jungkook's confusion deepened, so he continued. Mr. Jeon have been keeping eyes on everything since years ago, since he left the detention center, and was the one leading the case until Mr. Kang tried to play the smart and his own son to stop the investigation. But fortunately, Jonghyun didn't but went to coma. Jimin continued explaining further. For 30 years they have been thinking that something was wrong with Jongin because he doesn't showing any progress of waking up early anytime soon. But after digging deep, he got to know that Mr. Kang was drugging him to make his son's condition worse, like a slow poison working won't even get noticed if he dies from heart failure. And because Jongin death will resolve all his problems, but he didn't know that someone else was keeping an eye on him, and that was none other than Mr. Jeon himself. Last 3 years, Mr. Cheon is one visiting Jongin himself, keeping eyes on his recovery closely, and the doctor was already bought who listened to Mr. Cheon's words and not Kang's. So the medicine was replaced and Jongin health started to get better, without Mr. Kang getting aware, as doctor only gave him the false information. Jongin was the only person who could reveal his father's all secrets, including Jungkook's innocence. All the evidence had been already destroyed by Mr. Kang. Mr. Kang lost his mind when he got to know that Jongin has finally opened his eyes, because to him, his son should have been dead by now, but to his dismay, only after 2 months someone had reopened the case. Of course, Mr. Kang tried to find the family, but he was in protection of someone stronger, and eventually he figured out that it could be only Jungkook, but it was Mr. Jeon. Mr. Jeon has reopened the case as soon as Jongin opened his eyes. President Kang got no option but to send threat directly to Jeon to take back the case, as President was on the verge of getting exposed. Mr. Kang, who was on the ground, suddenly loved spitting the blood from his mouth. You have narrated a great story, by the way, but God don't believe on verbal stories and demands evidence. He sneered. Where do you gonna find evidence, loser? Jimin turned to him, throwing the phone at his direction, which had a video. Jongin had himself admitted everything to the investigation's cop, that night he fought with you and you tried to, but he ran away, he said, looking at Mr. Kang, who was slumped on the floor. Seeing the video of his son revealing everything despite his threats to not say anything, with no expression on his face. He didn't got into because of overdose, it was you injected that substance in him that night, and in the state of intoxication Jongin ended up into, but no, it was attempt to murder and still trying to keep him in coma after doctor is ready to reveal your secrets too. So Mr. Kang, now you got to know that only a cheap person like you can his own child for their own benefits. Upon hearing Jimin's words, Mr. Kang glared at Jimin sharply, his teeth clenched in anger and hatred. In a sudden move, he hurled a sharp object at Jimin, who quickly dodged it, but before he could do anything else, Jungkook tackled him on the ground. Don't you dare, he growled, hitting him in his all strength, which made Mr. Kang unconscious. It's waste to spend energy on him when he already defeated, so leave him and let the law give him the punishment for the whole world to know how cunning a person President Kang in real life. The hospital waiting room was filled with Jeon family and Wayne's grandmother, all of them anxiously waiting. As soon as they got to know the news, they immediately went to hospital. The atmosphere was heavy, the minutes stretching into what felt like eternity. Wayne's granny sat on a chair, her hands trembling as she quietly whispered prayers, her tear-streaked face a reflection of her helplessness. Mrs. John stayed close to her, her heart aching to see Vine in such vulnerable state. She wiped away her own tear, trying to stay strong for everyone else, but failing to hide the devastation in her eyes. Mr. John, stay usually a calm, collected, sat with his head in his hand, guilt coursing to him. Vine wasn't his biological daughter, but there he had never been a distinct in his mind. She was family just like Isha, and her suffering felt like Isha sat at the corner, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She kept replaying the events in her mind, blaming herself for letting go Vine alone that day. The weight of her guilt unbearable, her tears falling quietly as she hugged herself tightly. The sound of door opening broke the moment, and a doctor stepped out in the waiting area. Family of Vine, she asked, her voice calm but serious. Everyone rushed forward, their face etched with worry. How is she, doctor? She asked, clutching her chest as if bracing for the worst. Her breaths aren't deep, and fortunately there are no signs of assault, she explained, her voice gentle but firm. However, her wounds will take time to heal, and there's a chance she might experience PTSD from trauma. She needs your care, love, and more than ever. A strong support system will be crucial for her recovery. A wave of relief swept through the room, though it was tempered by the knowledge that Vine still deeply hurt. Granny let out a soft sob, a gratitude but remained visibly distressed, her aged frame trembling from emotional toll. Mrs. John placed a comforting arm around her, though her own heart ached just as deeply. She kept thinking about Vine. That innocent child didn't deserve this. A wave of guilt washed over her. Vine was in this situation because of their family. Mr. John clenched his fist, his emotions swirling between relief and blame. He wanted to protect Vine as he would his own daughter, but seeing her in this condition made him feel like he had failed. His protective nature was now mixed with a determination to make things right. As the waiting hours stretched on, the hospital half staff politely asked the Johns to leave for the night, as the only two people could stay by Vine's side. Granny insisted that she wanted to stay, but her condition made it clear that she needed rest. Mrs. Johns stepped in gently, assuring her, "You have been here for hours, Amma. Go home and rest. Come back fresh in the morning." With some persuasion, Granny agreed, reluctantly leaving with the rest of the family. Mrs. John, however, refused to leave. "I'll stay with her," he said firmly, her voice soft but resolute. "I can't leave her alone, not like this." The guilt gnawed at her relentlessly, knowing that Vine's suffering was tied to their family. She sat by Vine's beside, holding her hand, and her heart silently crying out as she prayed for Vine's recovery soon. For Mrs. John, this wasn't just about guilt, it was love. Vine was like a daughter to her, and she wouldn't leave her side until she was strong again. Vine drifted into a restless sleep, her mind spiraling into a whirlwind of memories and nightmares. At first, she found herself in a familiar scene from her childhood. She was just 3 years old, standing in the doorway of her grandmother's house, clutching her tiny hand into the fist. As tears streamed down her chubby cheeks, her father, suitcase in hand, was walking away. She cried, her small voice trembling with desperation, but he didn't turn back, not even once. As he disappeared into the distance, her tiny heart felt like shattered into pieces as grandmother wrapped her arms around her, whispering soothing words, but nothing could ease the ache of being left behind. The scene shifted suddenly, like a film reel jumping to a new frame. Vine was older now, standing in her living room on her 10th birthday. She had dressed up in her favorite pink dress, excitement bubbling inside her as she waited for her father's call. When the phone finally rang, her heart leapt with hope. "Happy birthday, baby," his voice echoed through the receiver, but before she could respond, he added, "I won't be able to make it today. I'm busy, but I have transferred the money to Amma for your gift. You can buy anything you want, Ryan." And just like that, he hung up. Her bright smile dimmed and tears filled her eyes. She didn't want to cry, not on her birthday, but the weight of disappointment was unbearable. She told her grandmother, saying that no one loves her, as she doesn't have any friends and no one going to be by her side. Upon hearing her words, grandmother felt immense sadness, and later kneeling in front of her with a gentle smile, she held out a small square glass container, inside which was a tiny turtle. "This is your gift, dear," she said softly, brushing Vine's hair back. "Turtle lives a long life, and now you have a new friend who will always accompany you. You're my brave child, Vine. Always remember that." The warmth of her grandmother's love made her smile through tears. She hugged her tightly, feeling a fleeting moment of happiness finding a new friend. But the dream twisted again, a past reshaping into another memory. This time Vine stood in front of her new house in Seoul. Her heart raced with anticipation. It was the day she moved into the neighborhood where the Jeons lived. She remembered the joy of meeting them, feeling first time like she had found the family she had always longed for. And then there was Jungkook. Her heart swelled with the affection for him, quietly admiring him from afar. But the sweetness of the memory turned bitter as his angry face appeared in her mind. "Stay away from me. Stop being so clingy," he had snapped, his irritation cutting through her like a knife. She had stood there frozen, her heart breaking again as she realized that happiness she thought she had found was slipping away. Was she looking for love in wrong place? Why did love always hurt? Why it felt like she was reaching for something she could never have? Before she could process the pain, the scene changed once more, dragging her into darkness. She was at the horrible place where she had been taken after the men kidnapped her. Their faces were cruel, their words sharp. She has weakly mumbled to those men that no matter how much torture they have done to her, Jungkook won't come because she isn't his sister and he doesn't care about her. She is just a stranger to him. They were shouting at each other for tapping the wrong girl, their frustration turning into violence. She crowded as the blows came, her body aching, her hope draining away. Vine was sobbing in her nightmare, feeling lost and broken. She thought it was the end. Her mind consumed by the pain and fear, but then the thought of chaos. She heard someone calling her name. The voice was desperate, filled with emotion, and it grew louder, clear with every second she tried to focus to understand if it was real or just her imagination. In her nightmare, she felt a warm embrace, a protective hold that steadied her trembling form. She could feel the man who held her soap taking her into his embrace. His lips trembled as he kissed her forehead, whispering words of encouragement as she heard him crying. In reality, Jungkook sat beside her, holding her trembling form close to his chest. He didn't know what was happening to her, but he couldn't able to see her in this condition, so hugged her tightly, arms wrapped around her protectively. His lips pressed a soft kiss to her temple as he muttered, "It's okay, you're safe now. I'm here. I'm so sorry." His voice cracked, his emotion raw as he tried to reassure her that she is safe now, wiping the tears from her eyes, having unshed of his own. Vine's tense body slowly started to relax in his arms as he stroked her hair, provided a sense of warmth. Her breathing evened out as if his presence chased away the darkness of her dreams. Somehow, even in her unconscious state, she found solace in her embrace, her tears subsiding in one person. She thought she hated her presence. Jungkook held her tighter, his own tears silently falling as he vowed to never let her again. His grip firm yet tender, silently promising himself that I'll never let you get hurt again. I'll protect you no matter what. Vine's eyes fluttered open, the dim light of the room making her blink a few times to adjust, but it was morning. The first thing she saw was Mrs. John sitting beside her, gently replacing the cold pad on her forehead with motherly care. The warmth in her touch and relieved smile that spread across her face when she noticed Vine was awake made the room feel less heavy. "You're awake, dear," she exclaimed, her voice filled with joy as she quickly reached to press the button to call the doctor. But Vine's mind was elsewhere entirely. Flashes of the night came rushing back. Someone had been with her through the storm of her nightmares, holding her close, whispering soothing words. She knew it wasn't Mrs. Young. Someone else had stayed by her side whole night, and her heart quietly longed for that presence. Vine had started to heal slowly under the loving care of those around her. Mrs. John stayed by her side most of the time, ensuring she had everything she needed and offering her the warmth of mother's love every day. Her granny visited her without fail, sitting by her bed, holding her hand and whispering the words of encouragement. Sometimes she bought her favorite snack, a story to read aloud, reminding Vine that she wasn't alone and they are here for her. Isha visited too, juggling her school responsibility with her guilt. She always tried to make Vine laugh, sharing stories about their classmates and bringing her notes from the school. But sometime in the middle of their conversation, Isha's voice would falter, her eyes would fill with tears. "I'm sorry, Vine," she had whispered more than once. "If I hadn't let you go alone that day, none of this would have happened. Everyone around me making me feel that please you don't start. No one knew's gonna happen." She wanted to forget about it. Despite the support, Vine's recovery was far from easy. The wounds on her body were healing, but the shadows of the trauma lingered. Nightmares and sudden moments of panic were inevitable. Yet she was never alone. Someone was always there to calm her, whether it was Mrs. John, her granny, or even Isha. Their presence slowly became her anchor, and love and care. Vine started to smile again, though faintly. However, amidst of all the care and support, one person was conspicuously absent. Hadn't even stepped into her room since she woke up. Even though everyone asked him to visit her, he stayed away, unable to face her. Mr. Jeon stepped out of the hospital after visiting Vine and found Jungkook sitting at a bench near the hospital garden. His son was staring at the ground, lost in the thought, his expression unreadable. Mr. Jeon approached quietly and sat down beside him. "You have been avoiding her," he said softly, breaking the silence. Jungkook didn't look up. "She doesn't need me," he replied, his voice flat. Mr. Jeon sighed. Doesn't need you. You have been taking care of her silently since the moment she got here. Don't think I haven't noticed it. Jungkook have been taking care of each smallest thing and comfort of wine, her medicine, if she eating properly, or at night she could able to sleep peacefully or not, keeping tabs of her growth to doctor, and because of Jungkook recommendation, wine was shifted to a room where she could have a better sunlight, helping her to feel more at ease, knowing the darkness bothers her now. Despite all effort, he just silently looks at her from afar because he doesn't have courage to face her. Jungkook tensed but didn't respond. You care about her, he continued, his tone gentle but firm. Jungkook's jaw tightened. Of course I care. Wine is important to our family and everyone loves her. That's not what I mean, and you know it. Jungkook finally turned to face his father, his expression conflicted. I don't know what you're talking about, he muttered, though the hesitation in his voice betrayed him. Mr. John gave him an annoying look. Jungkook, I'm your father. I can see it. The way you have been acting, the way you look at her, even from a distance. It's more than just a girl which is stopping you to meet her. You have feelings for her. Jungkook hands skulls into fist as he looked away again. And what if I have? He asked quietly. What good are those feelings when all I do is bring trouble into her life? If I wasn't in her life, she wouldn't be laying in that hospital bed right now. Mr. Jian sighed deeply, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. You're wrong, Jungkook. This wasn't your fault. You can't keep blaming yourself for something which isn't your control. And as for your feelings, denying them won't make them go away. It only hurt you more. Jungkook closed his eyes, his voice trembling with raw emotions. I don't want to hurt her anymore, Appa. I have already done enough damage. Mr. Jian looked at him with a mix of sadness and pride after hearing Jungkook calling him Appa again. He thought he would never able to listen it from his son. You think very bad of yourself, son. Might be because you have spent so long blaming yourself for everything, yet you have forgotten how much good there is in you. One sees it too, even if you can't. Jungkook remembered that despite knowing about his secret, Wine has chose to believe on him rather than blaming him for the accusation thrown at him. Jungkook swallowed hard, his thought died with emotion. He remembered what Jimin had revealed. Why didn't you ever tell me you were trying to protect me all these years ago? He asked, changing the subject abruptly. Mr. Jian froze for a second upon the fact Jungkook knew everything now, and soon his expression softened. Because I didn't want to burden you with my failures for not able to stop all the problems you might have faced when you were brought to detention center, and I was trying to fix things in my own way. But I know now I should have been more open with you. But again, things weren't in the favor when you came back. You had developed that thick wall outside your heart. I didn't want you to crumble those protective walls to trigger you anyway. But we still fought over the smallest disagreements. Jungkook's eyes glistened as he looked at his father. I hated you for so long, he admitted, his voice barely audible, for not being there for us. Meanwhile, all you were doing best to protect not only me but whole family. Mr. John smiled faintly, his eyes shining. And I always will till my last breath, but now it's your turn. Why needs you whether you believe it or not. You don't have to hide anymore, he said. I can see her eyes always searching for someone despite everyone is there beside her. She doesn't blame you for what happened, not anyone actually. She is really a brave and mature girl. Her father is really unlucky to abandon her. Mr. John turned to finally look at his son clearly. Don't be so hard on yourself when life is already being harsh. At least you could do take care of facing everything with a smile, knowing that this time shall pass too. Without a word, Jungkook leaned forward and hugged his father tightly. It was the first time in years they had embraced, and it was a moment of unspoken forgiveness and understanding. Mr. Jian held just as tightly, his heart swelling with the relief and pride. When they finally pulled apart, Mr. Jian stood, brushed off his jacket. I'm heading home now. Take care of yourself. Anisha is still here. Bring her back home before 8. Jungkook nodded, watching his father walk away. Jungkook stood near the hospital room window, his gaze fixed on Wine. Inside, Isha was sitting Wine beside, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke. "We finally be coming home in few days," she said, her grin wide. "Mama already planning to cook your favorite meals. Toki misses you too. He wanted to see you." Wine was missing Toki too, but she thanked her for taking care of her pet, though her face was still pale as she weakly said, "Yes, you're making it sound like I have been gone for years. I'm just glad to leave this place." "You have no idea how much we have missed you," she replied, leaning closer. "I can't wait to hang out like old times. I even made a playlist for us." Jungkook watched the scene silently, his chest tightening. He had avoided being alone with Wen since her recovery, unsure of how to face her after everything. Every time he saw her smile, it made him feel both relieved and unworthy. His hesitation weighed heavily on him, keeping him rooted in his place. Just then, the door of Wan's room opened and an old man stepped inside. Jungkook straightened immediately, his protective instincts kicking in. Without thinking, he moved forward to the door, his eyes fixed on the stranger. "Who is he?" he wondered, his pulse quickening. He was cautious after everything that happened to Wine and couldn't allow any potential threat near her. As he stepped into the room, ready to confront the man, Wine's soft voice stopped him cold. Jungkook froze in place, his eyes darting between Wine and the man. Stranger turned to face her, his expression a mix of guilt and longing. "Wine," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "How are you, my child?" Jungkook's breath hissed as he took a step back, feeling an unfamiliar pang in his chest. Her father, a real family. In the tears in Wine's eyes, the proof that this man she had probably longed for her whole life.